Myo Renge Kyo Nam Myo Renge Kyo Nam Myo Renge Kyo. Okay, hi everyone. Moving on. The priests of the Zen school disparaged the Lotus Sutra by calling it so much saliva that has been spit out of the mouth, a finger pointing at the moon, which is a twist on the Buddha's own words about seeking the moon and not focusing on the finger when he was admonishing his students for being too attached to the words instead of the meaning of his sermons. So they're using his very own example against his ultimate teaching. Or a net of doctrine that serves only to entangle. Obviously, doesn't that suggest that they just didn't understand it? The priests of the precepts, a Hinayana school, call the Lotus Sutra an erroneous teaching and label it as the preaching of the heavenly devil. Wow. Are persons such as these not slanderers of the correct teaching? One can never be too severe in condemning them or admonishing them too strongly. Nichiren was very adamant, but a lot of people assign this adamance to Nichiren alone in the scholarship of Buddhism, and that's just not so. I think that the translations of Nichiren's writings are probably more, direct. But, we find this all the way back 2,600 years ago in Buddha Shakyamuni's own sermons, when at the beginning of many sutra, he starts out by saying, everything I've taught you so far is incomplete. He doesn't say it's useless. He says it's incomplete. It's not the whole truth. It's not... In fact, he does say, discard my previous teachings. This now is what you need to know. So this isn't to say that earlier teachings are of no value whatsoever. It's that they're incomplete. They don't get you to the core of what Buddhism is about. And so in this way, you can say correct or incorrect. But I'm not sure that that's actually the words that Nichiren used. What Nichiren was doing was following exactly as Buddha Shakyamuni taught. That what you learned before is no longer effective. That in our time, in our country, in our capacity, we now can understand more deeply the true meaning of what Buddhism is about. So if you get stuck on these earlier teachings, they may have some value to lead you to understanding the Lotus Sutra, but that is the only value they have, because they will not, for you, accomplish quick and immediate enlightenment, awakening of your Buddha nature. So in this way, in an age of samurai, there is you could say, correct or incorrect way of practicing. But I just answered a question on Quora about somebody asking, is there such a thing as a true, quote-unquote, Buddhist? Unfortunately, the term true is often manipulated for nefarious purposes by authoritarians, people who want you to believe that they're superior or the only ones. The only thing you could say about a true quote-unquote Buddhist is somebody who studies Buddhism, who's actually, these are the three imperatives of Buddhist practice, right? Study, contemplation, and a resolute mind. So if you're studying, concentrating, and have a resolute mind, guess what? You are a true quote-unquote Buddhist. Of course, I could say that if you're not studying, contemplating, and developing a resolute mind, then what are you doing? You're just a random student, a purveyor of information. You could take the attitude that we're all bodhisattvas of the earth, as I do, and we're all the Sangha. This is a modern interpretation. We are in the latter day of the law, and that's how I see it. But you could also say that if you're not actually dedicated to studying the Buddhist doctrines and awakening yourself, then why would you call yourself a Buddhist? So, conversely, is there an untrue Buddhist? It's a silly question when you take it apart. And those who claim to be the only special ones that are true Buddhists, just listen to that statement. Isn't it arrogant? Isn't it full of ego and authoritarianship and trying to cull you into one little... I mean, that's just not Buddhism, is it? So I just caution you on these translations taking too hard a stance on what Nichiren was providing here. He was very, very scholarly in his analysis of the way to practice to achieve quickly, immediately, an enlightened mind. And there are a lot of other, as there are today, tons of groups and sects and factions, really, that all are looking for your allegiance. The true, quote-unquote, Buddhist isn't seeking allegiances, right? Because we're already part of equanimity in all of us having this Buddha nature and simply needing to reveal or awaken it. So it's not sectarian. Buddhism is not sectarian. Religion is sectarian because it's an authoritarian mechanism to control people and get money and allegiance. But that's not Buddhism. Okay? So let's continue. The unenlightened man said, throughout the more than 60 provinces of Japan, there are many kinds of people and a variety of Buddhist doctrines. What with the Nembutsu priests, the true word teachers, the followers of Zen, or the precepts teaching, there is truly hardly a single person who does not slander the correct teaching, or the most efficient teaching for this time and capacity of the people. This is the way Shakyamuni would have framed it, but in these translations of Nichiren, it's the correct teaching. Well, you can't fault him. It is the correct teaching for this time and our capacity. But it's easy to see that as more severe words. Words fail me here. It is a severe admonishment. But it doesn't include the flip side of it, which says that all of these other people are bad people. They're just not practicing the most efficacious, the most enlightening, quickly achieving enlightenment practice that was taught by Buddha Shakyamuni. They're failing to see the ultimate purpose of the teaching and the ultimate teaching itself. And this is lamentable. This has to be corrected, right? All right. So, but then, why should I criticize other people? So this is the crux of what Nichiren is talking about right here, this very question. My task, it seems to me, is simply to cherish deep, resolute mind and conviction within my own heart and to look on other people's errors as no concern of mine. Well, I think you can already understand that that's missing a part of the ultimate teaching, which is our bodhisattva practice. Our full awakening and enlightenment can only develop by helping others. So by being selfishly contained within one's own practice, one is not practicing completely the Buddha's teaching. It's incomplete, in Buddha's own words. The sage replied, quote, "What you say is quite true, and I would be inclined to hold the same opinion." Right? It's far easier to let people make their own mistakes, right? But when we examine the sutras, We find that they tell us not to begrudge our lives for the sake of the law, and also say that one should spread the Buddhist teachings even at the cost of one's life. You talk about severe admonishments. Think about that. Think about the resolute mind and dedication one has to have to attain full enlightenment. It doesn't fall short of, forget embarrassment, forget petty arguments. Would you lay down your life for the truth of awakening, enlightenment? That's a pretty adamant position, isn't it? The reason they speak in this way is because if one does not hesitate on account of others, but propagates the principles of Buddhism just as they are set forth in the sutras, then in an age when there are many people who slander the correct teaching, the most efficacious teaching, the ultimate teaching, three types of enemies will invariably appear and in many cases deprive one of life. So you're darned if you do and darned if you don't. Because if you aren't adamant about the ultimate way to practice Buddhism, to practice an awakening, then not only are you depriving yourself of full enlightenment, but what he's saying here is, in fact, you're depriving the society, your fellow man, about awakening. And the result of that is people going astray left and right and developing erroneous or bad views about life itself. And this is why enemies, quote unquote, wars, famine, those kinds of things occur, because nobody's correcting anyone. That's how we get governments that abuse the people, because they feel like, well, nobody's going to stop me, nobody's going to say anything, so I'm going to assume I'm right, and I'm just going to turn everyone into my slaves and have all the toys for myself, because nobody's bothering to stop them. You know, our countries, almost every country now is in the hundreds of thousands or millions of people in population, some billions. And if all of those people just sit on their hands and watch people be authoritarian and take control, there will always be those who do. And so by not being adamant about a correct position, a healthy position, an equanimous position, you in fact are allowing bad behaviors to propagate and strengthen themselves. This is the human experiment, isn't it? So it takes it's like being a parent. If you don't teach your children discipline, truth and lie, the difference between good behavior and bad behavior, and I'm not talking about social laws, although a lot of them are supposed to be based on that. I'm talking about parenting. If you don't admonish your child for bad behavior, then you're essentially telling the child, oh, I can get away with this, so I will do more. I will become really good at it, because there's nothing keeping me from developing that. And it's so immediately gratifying. It takes little effort, right? It takes effort. It takes courage to be happy. It takes effort to be a better person, to see the greatness and the awe of the process of life. It's really easy to just sit back and let life happen and then take advantage of moments for immediate gratification and the heck with everyone else, right? It's easy to do that. Part of the reasons it's easy, though, as Nichiren is talking here, is because nobody's bothering to stand up against it. This is very much a dimension of the Bodhisattva practice, right? So, but if, as the sutras tell us, one observes deviations from the Buddha's teachings and yet fails to censure them or to appeal to the ruler to take measures against them, then one is being untrue to the teachings and is not worthy to be looked on as a disciple of the Buddha. In other words, as I was saying earlier, you're not really practicing Buddhism at that point. You're just a voyeur. You're just what? A passive student? That's not, passive isn't part of the word resolute or determined, is it? The third volume of the Nirvana Sutra says, quote, if even a good monk sees someone destroying the teaching and disregards him, failing to reproach him, to oust him, or to punish him for his offense, then you should realize that that monk is betraying the Buddha's teaching. But if he ousts the destroyer of the law, reproaches him, or punishes him, then he is my disciple and a true voice hearer. The meaning of this passage is that if a person striving to propagate the correct teaching of the Buddha should hear and see others propounding the teachings of the sutras in a mistaken manner, and fail to reproach them himself, or, lacking the power to do that, fail to appeal to the sovereign and in this way take measures to correct them, then he is betraying the Buddha's teaching. But if, as the sutras direct, he is not afraid of others, but censures these slanderers himself, and appeals to the sovereign to take measures against them, then he may be called a disciple of the Buddha and a true priest or monk. So take heed, all you tattletales. Being, therefore, determined to avoid the charge of betraying the Buddha's teaching, although I have incurred the hatred of others, I have dedicated my life to Shakyamuni Buddha and the Lotus Sutra, extending compassion to all living beings and rebuking slanders of the correct teaching. Those who cannot understand my heart have tightened their lips and glared at me with furious eyes. But if you are truly concerned about your future existence, you should think lightly of your own safety and consider the law above all. Thus, the great teacher Chang'an states, quote, a royal envoy would rather, even though it cost him his life, in the end, conceal none of the words of his ruler. Means that, end quote, means that one's body is insignificant while the law is supreme. One should give one's life in order to propagate the law. So that's some resolute mind right there, isn't it? This passage is saying that even if one must give up one's life, one should not conceal the correct teaching. This is because one's body is insignificant while the law is supreme. Though one's body may be destroyed, one should strive to propagate the law. How sad is it, this lot of ours, that all who are born must perish. Though one may live to a great age, in the end one cannot escape this impermanence. In this world of ours, life lasts 100 years or so at the most. When we stop to think of it, it is a mere dream within a dream. Even in the heaven where there is neither thought nor no thought, where life lasts 80,000 years, no one escapes the law of mutability. And in the heaven of the 33 gods, too, where life lasts 1,000 years, it is swept away at last by the winds of change and decay. So he's referring to cultural folklore and so forth, just as Buddha did, to try to make the point clearer. How much sadder, then, is the lot of the human beings living on this land of Jambudvipa, whose life is more fleeting than the dew, more fragile than the plantain leaf, or insubstantial than bubbles or foam. Like the moon reflected in the water, one is not even certain whether one exists or not. Like the dew on the grass, one may vanish at any moment. Anyone who grasps this principle should know that it is of utmost importance to take thought for the existence to come. In the latter day of the Buddha, joy increasing, the monk realization of virtue propagated the correct teaching. Countless monks who were guilty of violating the precepts deeply resented this votary and attacked him. But the ruler, king possessor of virtue, determined to protect the correct teachings, fought with these slanderers. In the end, he lost his life and was reborn in the land of the Buddha Akshobhya, where he became the foremost disciple of that Buddha. Similarly, King Senyo, because he honored the Mahayana teachings and punished the slanderer of 500 Brahmins, was able to reach the stage of non-regression. How reassuring that those who respect the monks of the correct teaching and admonish those who are evil and in error receive such blessings as these. So once again, obviously, this is the hyperbole of Buddhism, referring to cultural stories and folklore of the day. I think maybe at some point I might endeavor to use some of the Western fables and stories to make these Buddhist points. That might be helpful as a reference, because we all grow up learning Aesop's fables and other things. I don't know so much anymore. If there's any current stuff, I'll have to look that up. But I just want you to understand conceptually that these aren't literal words, but they're examples that when he says lay down your life, he's not talking about putting a sword into your gut and committing seppuku, right? What he's talking about, laying down your life, is dedicating at that level your life. Your life as a human being is brief already. Okay? So he's saying, if you're going to die anyway, die for the Lotus, die for the law, die for the correct teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha. He's not saying now expire at this moment. Right? So he's talking about life being extremely fragile and precious and fleeting. So why would you hesitate for one moment in that fleeting instance of what our dream of this life is, which could end at any moment? Why would you want it ever to end without having dedicated yourself to the correct teaching? That's what this is saying. I hope that helps clear that up. But if in our present age one were to practice shoju rather than shakabuku, then without doubt that person would fall into the evil past together with those who slandered the correct teaching. So he's addressing this unenlightened man directly, and he's saying, if you hear people or see people incorrectly or incompletely practicing the ultimate with teachings of Buddha, which are correct for this age, and you fail to admonish them, or you just let them be and say, well, then you're just as guilty as they are of not practicing correctly. He's questioning your dedication, your resolute mind. The great teacher Nanhui, in his 4 peaceful practices, states, quote, if there should be a bodhisattva who protects evil person and fails to chastise them, then when his life comes to an end, he will fall into the hell along with all those evil persons. The meaning of this passage is that if a practitioner of Buddhism should fail to chastise evil persons who slander the law, but give himself up entirely to meditation and contemplation, not attempting to distinguish between the correct and incorrect doctrines or provisional and true teachings, but rather pretending to be a model of compassion, then such a person will fall into the evil paths along with the other doers of evil. Now, a person who fails to correct the true word, Nembutsu, Zen, and precepts adherents, who are slanderers of the correct teaching, and instead pretends to be a model of compassion, will meet just such a fate as this. So, it's pretty specific. Thereupon the unenlightened man, cherishing his resolve in mind, spoke out in these words, quote, to admonish one's sovereign and set one's family on the correct course is the teaching of the worthies of former times and is clearly indicated in the text you've just cited. The non-Buddhist writings all emphasize this point, and the Buddhist teachings are in no way at variance with it. To see evil and fail to admonish it, to be aware of slander and not combat it, is to go against the words of the sutras and to disobey the Buddhist patriarchs. The punishment for this offense is extremely severe, and therefore from now on I will devote myself to resolute mind and conviction. But it is truly difficult to put this sutra, the Lotus, into practice. If there is some essential point to be observed, could you explain it to me? Oh. The sage replied, I can tell you that your aspiration for the way is very earnest and sincere. The essential thing the Buddhas needed in order to attain the true way or enlightenment is nothing other than the 5 characters of Myoho Renge Kyo. It was solely because of these 5 characters that King Suzudan relinquished his jeweled throne and attained Buddhahood, and the Dragon King's daughter transformed her reptilian characteristics into those of a Buddha. When we stop to consider it, we find that the sutra itself says concerning how much or how little of it is to be embraced, that a single verse or phrase is sufficient. And concerning the length of practice necessary to reach enlightenment, that one who rejoices even for a moment on hearing it is certain to become a Buddha. The 80,000 teachings in their vast entirety and the many words and phrases of the 8 volumes of the Lotus Sutra were all expounded simply in order to reveal these 5 characters. When Sakyamuni Buddha in the clouds above the sacred mountain, in the mists of Eagle Peak, or Vulture Peak, depending on how you translate it, summed up the essence of the doctrine and entrusted it to the bodhisattvas of the earth, what do you suppose that teaching was? It was nothing other than these 5 characters, the essential law. This is a very important statement, in that so many sects and groups and others strive to say that the Lotus Sutra, and scholarship outside of Buddhism, says the Lotus Sutra is this wonderful teaching that's all self-congratulatory but never really says anything. They miss it. They miss the point. And Nichiren says it right here. What do you suppose that teaching was? He's saying this repeated words throughout the Lotus Sutra, the title of every chapter, the title of the sutra itself, that's the subject he's talking about. And every chapter defines every period of Shakyamuni's teachings and culminates them in that teaching which is Myoho Renge Kyo. This is what Nichiren is saying right here. The 6,000 leaves of a commentary by Tindai and Miao, like strings of jewels, and the several scrolls of exegesis by Tao Sui and Hin Tsing Man, like so much gold, do not go beyond the meaning of this teaching. If you truly fear the sufferings of birth and death and yearn for nirvana, if you carry out your resolute mind and conviction and thirst for the way, then the sufferings of change and impermanence will become no more than yesterday's dream. And the awakening of enlightenment will become today's reality. If only you chant Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, then what offense could fail to be eradicated? What blessings could fail to come? This is the truth, and it is of great profundity. You should believe and accept it. The unenlightened man, pressing his palms together and kneeling respectfully, said, quote, "These priceless words of yours have moved me deeply, and your instruction has awakened my mind. And yet, in light of the principle that superior things encompass those that are inferior, it would seem that the broad should also encompass the narrow, and that many should take in the few. However, when we examine the matter, we find that these 5 characters you have mentioned are few, while the words in the sutra are many, and that the Daimoku or title of the Lotus Sutra is narrow, while its 8 scrolls are very broad. How then can the 2 be equal in the blessings that they bring? Or blessings, merit would be the more traditional translation, right? But these are Westerners, so they have a Western frame. The translators, I mean. The sage said, "How foolish you are! Your attachment to this belief that one should abandon the few in favor of the many towers higher than the Mount Sumeru, and your conviction that the narrow should be despised by the broad despised and the broad honored is deeper than the vast ocean. In the course of our discussion, I have already demonstrated that something is not necessarily worthy of honor simply because it has many numbers, or despicable simply because it is few. Now I would like to go a step farther and explain how the small can actually encompass the great, and one be superior to the many. And on that note,